Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, this podcast is about all things guitar. Well, hey there, everybody, and welcome into another episode of Shad's Guitar Show. As always, I am Shad, your host, and glad that you're joining me for another episode. We are just, as this episode comes out, I believe maybe 2 weeks before Christmas. And I know I've said it already a couple of times, but I do truly hope this is a great season for you, that you are enjoying time with friends and family, and just getting to experience the joy of Christmas. I know that's not always the case for everybody, but hopefully this episode finds you happy and healthy and enjoying the season. So with that, let's move into today's topic, which is boutique guitars and boutique gear in general. And not necessarily, I know I've covered this boutique guitars in the past, but I really started thinking about it and wanted to go back to the beginning. Like, where did it all start? Who were the early pioneers of boutique gear, guitars, pedals, amplifiers? And this kind of came to light because, as you guys know, I have a guitar company, which you would consider a boutique guitar company, called Retro Sound Guitars. And I'm about to do a show in January called Wood, Wire, and Volts. And it's a small guitar show that is dedicated to featuring, small boutique builders. And, as I'm getting involved in this and really thinking through my booth and how everything's going to look, just kind of thinking in this boutique mode, I started wondering, there's so many, as I was looking at the list of vendors that are going to be at the show, there's so many amazing guys out there and ladies, it's not defined certainly just to guys, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of people out there doing amazing things in the boutique world, whether it's with amps or pedals or guitars. So I just kind of wanted to go back a little bit in history and sort of look at where it all started, who were the pioneers of the quote unquote boutique, world, and learn a little about that. So hopefully this will be interesting to you. Some of these names, well, all of these names I knew, and I'm sure you probably will too, but kind of the timeline of when these brands came on the scene and a little bit about them. So let's go ahead and dive into the history of boutique gear. All right, so today we're talking about the very first boutique gear builders, the pioneers who took the craft out of factories and into small shops, garages, basements, back rooms, and basically just started to hand build instruments and gear for players who wanted something more. So before we talk about the names, we kind of need to set the stage. Today, I think in most of our minds, boutique means small batch craftsmanship, custom one-off builds, obsessive attention to detail, premium parts, and often a builder-to-player relationship. But the first boutique makers weren't boutique in the modern marketing sense. They were outliers who built gear because the big brands couldn't or wouldn't. In the 50s through the 70s, Fender and Gibson obviously dominated, and nearly everything else was factory made. So the earliest boutique builders were visionaries responding to very specific player needs. And that brings us to the real pioneers. All right, so let's head back to the end of the 60s and into the beginning of the 70s. And discuss what I believe are a couple of the first boutique guitar brands. Number one is Alembic, and they were founded in late 69, early 70 in Northern California. Now, the founders were Ron Wickersham, Rick Turner, and Bob Matthews, and their whole vibe was kind of like aerospace grade components, custom electronics, multi-laminate necks. And they had notable players like Stanley Clarke, Phil Lesh, Jack Cassidy, and Jerry Garcia. Alembic is widely considered the first true boutique guitar or bass company. They were not in any way copying Fender or Gibson. They were building Super hi-fi instruments handcrafted with exotic woods and futuristic electronics. Alembic mission was pretty simple: make the highest quality stringed instruments ever built. And for a while, they were the most expensive guitars on earth. All right, number 2, Travis Bean, from 1974 to 1979, also a California-based company. The founders were Travis Bean, Mark McElwee, and Gary Kramer. And Kramer's name will obviously come up later on. Their signature thing was aluminum necks, and they had tons and tons of sustain. They had players, again, Jerry Garcia, Keith Richards, Bill Wyman, Stanley Jordan. Travis Bean wasn't boutique in the factory woodshop sense, but in that spirit, they absolutely were. A small team, radical innovation, hand-built construction. Their aluminum neck guitars were unique, expensive, and aimed at players who wanted something Fender or Gibson just flat weren't offering. All right, number 3 is Hamer, and they were located in Illinois. And the founders were Joel Danzig and Paul Hamer. Their signature kind of vibe was custom shop quality Explorer and Flying V-style guitars for rock players in the early days. Early adopters of the Hamer guitars were Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick, Judas Priest, Def Leppard, and Glenn Tipton. Hamer is sometimes called the first boutique electric guitar brand of the modern era because they made small batch, high-end, player-focused, non-mass-produced guitars. And this was well before Gibson ever had a custom shop. So if Alembic was the hi-fi side of boutique, Hamer was the rock and roll boutique pioneer. And last up in the 70s, the mid-70s, and pre-mass production era of this company was B.C. Rich. Now, I know a lot of us think of B.C. Rich now as, the super pointy, crazy, super heavy metal guitars. But it was founded by Bernie Rico here in California, and their signature was hand-built exotic and aggressive shapes. Eagle, Mockingbird, Bitch, and they had players like Joe Perry, Rick Derringer, later on Slash, Lita Ford, and before BC Rich became a big brand in the 80s metal scene, they were absolutely boutique. Each guitar a custom order, handcrafted by a small team using neck-through construction and wild tone-shaping electronics. Early BC Rich guitars are still some of the finest handmade instruments of the era. All right, so let's touch on some of the amp builders in the early days that would qualify as boutique amp builders. Alexander Dumble obviously comes to mind from the late 60s through the early 70s. He was making custom hand-built amps, had players like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Robin Ford, Larry Carlton, Eric Johnson, and John Mayer. This is boutique at its purest. One man, one workshop, one amp at a time. Every Dumble was made for a specific player. No mass production. No two amps exactly the same. The boutique amp movement starts here for sure. And as we all know, Dumble amps are fabled and have some of the highest price tags of any amplifiers you'll ever find. And there aren't that many out there. And, most of the big name players already have bought most of them up. But if you do find one for sale, it's going to set you back a lot of money. Another amazing amp company from the early 80s is Trainwreck, and it was founded by Ken Fisher. Now, Trainwreck amps have been used by players like Brad Paisley, Mark Knopfler. It's rumored that maybe even Eddie Van Halen had some of the early Trainwreck stuff, as well as Warren Haynes. Trainwreck amps were kind of the spiritual successor to Dumble. Hand-wired by a single builder, incredible touch sensitivity, built in very small quantities, and highly personalized. Fisher even signed his amps with women's names, Ginger, Olivia, Linda, instead of serial numbers. All right, so moving into the 80s, we have Tom Anderson, who founded Tom Anderson Guitar Works in 1984. His signature thing was high precision superstrats with perfect fretwork and boutique electronics. Early on, he had players like Alan Holdsworth. This would have been obviously pre-Carvin. Jerry Cantrell, obviously pre-GNL, and Keith Howland, and lots of studio pros. Tom Anderson set the bar for what perfect modern guitars could be. They weren't wild shapes, they were master-built evolutions of classic designs for the most demanding players. They set the tone for what Sir, Tyler, Schecter Custom Shop, and the entire modern boutique S-style industry would eventually become. Next up, we have Valley Arts, founded in the 70s, but really peaked in the 1980s. And they were also here in California. Their signature design were custom super strats, early hot rodded builds with even some graphite neck options. And they had, studio, luminaries like Steve Lukather, Larry Carlton, Mike Landau, Lee Ritenour. Valley Arts became the guitar for high-end session players during the LA studio boom. Every player walking in and out of Capitol Records or Ocean Way seemed to have one. Their instruments were meticulously built, custom order, loaded with cutting-edge hardware, ultra consistent, and they helped define the boutique session guitar. And though we don't think of this company as boutique today, just because the level that they've reached, founded in 1985 by Paul Reed Smith is, of course, Paul Reed Smith Guitars. Their signature was carved top double cut, 25-inch scale, bird inlays, perfectionist craftsmanship. And early on, they had players like Carlos Santana, Howard Leese, David Grissom, and Al Di Meola, who really, Santana and probably Howard Leese, I would say as well, sort of put PRS on the map, but certainly Santana. Early on, PRS was definitely boutique to its core. Small shop, hand-built guitars, made-to-order instruments for top-tier players. Before they grew into a major manufacturer, the brand was boutique, like an East Coast answer to Anderson or Valley Arts. And like I said earlier, Carlos Santana's endorsement really helped push the boutique guitar into the mainstream of rock. And next we have James Tyler Guitars. Now, they were around in the late 70s, but really defined in the 80s. And the founder was, of course, James Tyler. And their signature was hot-rodded, heavily customized S and T style guitars. They had players like Mike Landau, Dan Huff, Steve Lukather. Obviously, these were heavy hitters in the studio world. And if Anderson was the scientific, Tyler was the mad scientist. His early guitars were custom shop masterpieces built for the LA session elite who wanted hotter pickups, wilder finishes, more stability, better fretwork, modern versatility, and Tyler became synonymous with the LA boutique Superstrat sound, and still are today. And lastly on the list is Schecter. Now, we don't think of Schecter as boutique today, but in their custom shop era, 1980 to say 1983-ish, they were definitely a boutique guitar maker. Before they became known for the metal guitars of the 2000s, in the early 80s, the company was a tiny Los Angeles-based boutique guitar and parts maker. They built custom T-style guitars, S-style builds, and really high-end replacement parts. An early player of Schecter guitars from that era was Pete Townsend, who famously played early Schecters in the Face Dances era of The Who. And their limited batch custom shop builds were as boutique as it gets. All right, and some of the boutique amps of the 80s, certainly Soldano, founded in 1987 by Mike Soldano. And his signature thing was high gain, high clarity, and certainly the SLO 100 is the high watermark for that whole sound. Early players in the Journeyman era, he had Eric Clapton playing his amps, Warren D. Martini, George Lynch, Mark Knopfler, Mike Landau. And the SLO 100 basically invented high-end boutique high-gain amps and would ultimately influence brands like Mesa Boogie, Bogner, the PV50 150, in the modern era, Friedman amps, and almost every other modern high-gain amp. Soldano is easily one of the most important boutique builders ever in the amp world. And then founded in 1989, we have Bogner Amplification. Reinhold Bogner was the founder, and he had some players like Eddie Van Halen, who adopted some of the early mods from the Bogners, Steve Stevens, Jerry Cantrell. Bogner hit at the very end of the 80s, just in time to change the sound of actually 90s rock. Their boutique hand-built amps offered British-inspired tones, boutique-level craftsmanship, and modern versatility. And Bogner helped bridge the gap between Dumble-level boutique mystique and modern rock power. Next up, though we don't consider them a boutique brand, maybe necessarily today, is Mesa Boogie. But their boutique era was really early 70s into the 80s. The founder was Randall Smith. The notable models in the 80s are the Mark II C Plus and the Studio 22. Players like Kirk and James from Metallica, Carlos Santana, Larry Carlton, Prince all used Mesa Boogie, or at the time Boogie amps. And while they eventually scaled up, their early era was 100% boutique. And the 80s is when their amps became legendary. The Mark II C Plus may be the most famous boutique modified production level amp ever built. All right, and getting into some of the early boutique pedals, we have Pete Cornish, who made pedals in the 70s and 80s. He really made a lot of custom pedal boards, but his pedals are very legendary and go for really high prices on the used market now. And some of the early players that liked and used his pedals were David Gilmour, Brian May, and Andy Summers of the Police. Cornish was making true boutique pedals long before the term even existed. Next up is the Chandler Tube Driver in the 1980s. The founder was B.K. Butler, and players like Eric Johnson in particular and David Gilmour have both really used this pedal to great effect, and they have had these on their boards for a long time, and it's really a big part of their sound. The Tube Driver wasn't a mass-produced product in the modern sense. It was hand-built boutique gear, beloved for studio quality tone. And although it was a 90s pedal, we can't skip the pedal that I actually made an episode on not long ago, which is the Klon, right? Probably the most expensive and most famous and both and most copied and highly fabled pedal out there. And the builder obviously was founder Bill Finnegan, and he had players like Jeff Beck, Joe Perry, Nels Cline, Warren Haynes, John Mayer. All these guys are, have used or are using Klon pedals, as well as a host. I mean, if you could do a who's who of guys who have real Klon pedals. The company, I don't know if I just mentioned this, but it was actually from 1994. And I think I said this in my Klon episode, but just to kind of go back and say it again, I was actually working for a local music store part-time when this pedal came out, and I did not understand it. To me, I was like, it's huge, it looks ugly, and it doesn't even have distortion. I mean, this was the time when we were all using like Boss Metal Zones and things, and at that time I was trying to get like the highest level of gain, and that was when the scooped thing was real popular. And this pedal I did not understand. I thought, who would pay this much money for a pedal that has barely any distortion and really doesn't do much for your sound? And it wouldn't be until much, much later in my playing career that I understood the value of this pedal and just why it is so revered. But the Klon is, in my mind, the undisputed king of the, tiny batch built, by hand guitar pedals of the early days. Before the Klon, boutique pedals were very rare. After the Klon, thousands of builders emerged. So it sort of started this whole new wave of boutique and small built pedals that we would see all through the 90s and all through today. So I guess it kind of begs the question, why did boutique companies even start? Well, the big companies, frankly, got too big, and we saw the quality of the things they were building, especially Fender and Gibson in the 70s and even into the 80s, the quality absolutely dipped. Players wanted better materials. They wanted more personality in their instruments, more customization options. And that's when the small builders stepped up. And I think that tradition carries on even today with small builders that are emerging almost on the daily, it seems like. Anytime you go on Instagram, there's another guitar builder or amp builder or pedal company. And you know what? That's awesome. I think there's room for everybody to do their thing. And I think the era, we're never going to see another big guitar company, I don't think. There's never going to be another Fender or Gibson or PRS or Ibanez. I think those days are over, and the new things that we see coming out will be small, hand-built, boutique-style instruments. But I think we all, or many of us, I shouldn't say we all, but a lot of us really value the boutique world because we do want something different, and we do understand the value of what some small builders are doing. And again, I can say this with absolute conviction, owning and running retro sound guitars. I mean, it's always been my goal to create a custom shop level instrument at a price point that is competitive with, the big brands, just kind of normal, nothing special off the rack guitars. And I think we see that with a lot of small builders, is that we're offering something that gives you a lot more value. And there will always be those players who want the name, right? It's got to say Gibson or Fender or PRS or whatever your personal choice is. You want that name. You want that prestige on the headstock. And that is how, the big companies will stay in business. The casual guitar player that only knows about those brands, who hasn't, gone deeper into the boutique world, or the guy who just likes likes owning a Gibson custom shop Les Paul. Those are the guys who'll buy there. And there's nothing wrong with that. More power to you. But for a lot of us, we do appreciate what the boutique world offers. All right, so that's going to do it for this episode on the first boutique builders. And honestly, in this day and age where it's so easy to find a great handcrafted guitar, a one-off fuzz pedal, or a custom amp built by a builder in a garage, these guys, their lineage all traces back to the pioneers. And these pioneers proved that small shops could make world-class gear, and oftentimes much better than big factories. And they shaped the boutique world that we know and love today.